Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This is an encounter that I had not so long after getting rid of the lurker of the dark web and his cohorts. However, it took me several days to fully comprehend the event and also to stop screaming at night. It was about 3 days after the cleanup was finished and when there were no missing flags matching the descriptions of the deceased, I was asked to look into a hypothetical cryptid. It didn't sound as much a request, but payment for services rendered. When I asked for any information regarding this hypothesis, the only thing known was the name, Leviathan. The resources of the Mortician Network apparently does have some limits, and while they didn't have a submersible on hand, they were owed favors by people of influence. Not exact resources, but close enough for most to consider them as such. However, this favor the Morticians would be calling on was the investigation of this cryptid. A retired naval officer from a country that I have been asked not to identify had reported an awareness of a monster that dwelt below the waves. Official naval protocol worldwide was to squash any reports of information regarding this cryptid, but the officer suffered from what he dubbed narcophobia. He couldn't sleep as a conscious act because he would see it again. Given the sleeping patterns he endures, the credibility of any reliable information is of the most suspect quality. But subsequent investigations found that there were others who also suffered from narcophobia, who also were in their naval equivalents, and all were part of a submarine crew. This particular eccentric witness managed to retain coherency and had become obsessed with identifying this creature. Using his knowledge and engineering skills, he crafted a small submersible that barely registered on sonar, but he needed a witness who was fresh to verify his visions. I was elected to be the witness to a madman's quest for answers. So, I met the man who looked to be redefining the expression sleep-deprived, and he led me to his submersible. As I was not involved with submarines or anything nautical while in the army, I couldn't give a good approximation on the size of the vehicle. He showed me how it works in ramblings, and I had to endure multiple times to comprehend. Checklists were followed, food and water rations were verified, and the fuel reserves were confirmed to be accurate, and then we dove underwater. It took us 2 days to get to the area. I heard the same tale told over and over again for the first 14 hours. Human corpses found with giant bite marks and no matchable mouth castings to identify the creature. Shutting the man up permanently was something that I considered frequently, until he turned to me with a big smile and his declaration of how he was going to go to bed now, and then promptly fell asleep. Our location was under the giant plastic island in the Pacific Ocean. I can't really relay the latitude and longitude because I could never figure out how the damn thing was calculated, and for another reason that you will discover shortly. I napped as well for a few hours, and upon waking up, I went to the cockpit and looked around. The retired naval officer was looking down with a grimace. One of the spotlights was locked onto a patch of coral. "Can you see it?" he asked softly. I looked at the location bathed in light for a couple of moments. Then I realized there was something hiding on top of it. Have you ever seen those photos of a man who hides in plain sight by painting himself to look like the background? This is what it was like the camouflage capabilities of the chameleon or some other creatures in the animal kingdom. It was huge, at least 80 feet in length. I had no idea how quick until a large shark got a little too close, and within a blink, and I am being literal, it went from hiding to devouring the shark like the creature Gollum with the live fish in the Lord of the Ring movies. Except, Gollum wasn't dark brown color with 3 arms, one reaching over from behind. The growl this thing emitted while eating shook the submersible. It was happy with the snack. The arm looked like it had been broken and allowed to fix suboptimally, causing bone warping. It had 4 legs and they moved like a spider with half its legs but better balance. "That's it. Leviathan," he whispered happily. Then I looked up and wished that I had met a fully formed Jersey Devil. The recollections were after the fact, but one of the first things I knew was that I screamed for almost 20 minutes without pausing for breath. I had no idea until I was being shaken back into reality. I noticed my throat and face were sore, and apparently I had been screaming. He had tried slapping me in the face a few times to get me to stop, to no avail. And when he asked what was wrong, I just pointed to the aberration above us. It was a gargantuan. It was like massive flesh from which tendrils drooped and spread out. At the end were things, monsters, that defied all natural logic, but they kept shifting their forms like the mass to which they were connected. "What are you looking at?" Words that seemed to resonate within me. I turned to face the man, but that was when I noticed that there was a face in front of the submersible. The flesh seemed to crawl, and the eyes didn't seem empty, just hungry. My mind started to scream, and I just stood there frozen. From the files I have read and things I have seen, there is an acceptance of fate, people who seem to know when it's their time. This thing triggered an oxymoronic sense within me, and this thing was not from this world, but it belongs here. What felt like an ice pick getting slammed into my brain caused a blindingly painful migraine, and when I went to move any part of my face, another ice pick of pain was slammed into me. The only thing I could move without an almost debilitating level of agony was my eyes. I was forced to stare at this face, which seemed to be made of creatures that should have never existed in our world. "What are you looking at?" the voice asked again, and I just stared at this thing's face as it seemed to implode and withdraw back to the rest of its mass, hidden beneath the plastic convergence in the Pacific. "I think we should leave," came a voice that was actually familiar. The last thing I remember was trying to figure out what the thing sounded like and me convulsing. I had always thought being soulless would be the greatest protection against cryptids and the like. The Jersey Devil showed me that some cryptids don't care. The Leviathan showed me that there was far more to this world than I dared to dream. I think I know why most cryptids to do with the ocean are quasi-humanoid. They cannot fully comprehend the thing which apparently triggered a grand mal seizure within me. I was in observation for 6 days, mainly due to the night terrors. It stares at me when I close my eyes. The concerning thing is, it is getting closer whenever I sleep. It turns out that the morticians have been neglecting a section of their case files for me. And while I have archived some of the more known cryptids, I wasn't even aware of this subcategory until I was summoned to an incident scene. In a large field, there was one of those dopey crop circles, but the actual scene was on the edge of a neighboring forest area. I saw a young female dead and scorched by a weapon or energy that I couldn't readily identify. And then I saw an 8-foot tall black-skinned humanoid with a head that was larger than a normal person. Given the color of the skin and the dwindling ambient light, it was not readily apparent on why this entity was there as well. Only complete lack of movement indicated that it was dead too. When it was rolled over, I saw that the nose was almost non-existent and the teeth looked more like fangs. The eye sockets appeared to be a bit lighter than the victim's. And looking at this new corpse, I turned to the attending active mortician. She looked at me and then sighed deeply. She pulled out a large folder, and using the light from my cell phone, I saw the case file name. Alien Event, number 0001, Civilian. I looked at the mortician, and before I could ask the obvious question, she told me the worrying answer. 813, including this incident. The file in my hands was quite thick, thicker than the others, and I have looked at it in the past when I got my hands on the physical file. I offered to help the mortician with this incident, then I would document both. She acquiesced and she gave me the instructions. UV lamps and 2 gurneys. I grabbed the light stands and I carried them over, positioning them in the places indicated. And when they were turned on, the alien corpse glowed softly and the injuries inflicted upon the human corpse glowed as well. Map out the crop circle, came an instruction that I was not expecting. I will need exact measurements of any circles. The area would be good too. Also, total length of the whole thing as well. I paused for a moment and nodded. I had always figured out that the crop circles were just bored teenagers or farmers, which, when you think about it, makes absolutely no sense. Not that they can't be man-made, but the reason for it. What would increased visitors to a farm do in terms of sale of product? I found a headlamp and a measuring tape with a spike on the end, as well as a notebook. I set about my task, and it was simple, but several times I stopped. I was being watched. Something was observing me with an intent that I could not identify. Looking around, I saw nothing the first 3 times. But while measuring the largest circle, I both heard and saw it. Another 8-foot black-skinned humanoid was standing in the cornfield with me. It had partially stepped out of the corn and was partially onto the circle. Its slightly bulbous eyes had no discernible pupil. Its chest moved deeply with its breathing, and we stared at each other for about 40 seconds, and then it walked away. I resumed my measurements, noting them all down, 8 circles in total. 3 were quite large, and while I reported the measurements to the mortician, she nodded along as I read it all out. But she froze after I finished. I immediately looked to see if the other one was back, but there was no sight of it. When I inquired as to her freezing, she explained that there is an arrangement between the organization and the black ones. She then immediately refused to elaborate further. We loaded the bodies in and then drove to a compound. I mentioned that I saw one of the black ones while measuring. Her glance seemed to be concerned, then I had a flash of insight. You autopsied their experiments, and that was all you ever did, but with the corpse of one of them along with an experiment indicates that there is greater trouble than we are aware of, right? Things have changed and you are unsure of how... I trailed off. How quickly can you conduct an autopsy on the black one? I asked, my gaze peering into the side of the rearview mirrors. Couple hours. Know anything about them biologically? Weaknesses, capabilities, things that might be useful, just in case. Only what is reported in the first case. It's a really long read. So after I wheeled the bodies to the mortuary, I read the case file. Case file. Serial killer, eyeless. Related topics, Black Xenos. It is not often that we directly interfere with the lives of the regular populace, but this was one time where we were forced to act. What is not known is that before Jack the Ripper, there was another active serial killer. However, we made damn sure nobody knew about him. Eyeless, as we would refer to himself, was the only known surviving member of the Xeno experiments. However, since they failed to deliver his corpse, he went completely insane and started to kill people at random. The first victim was a 28-year-old dock worker, Jeremiah Langston. Little was recorded about the abduction of Jeremiah, but the only indication of anything unusual was a deranged scream about how he must be made to see. Jeremiah's body was found with an extra set of 8 eyes inserted into wounds on his corpse. The one thing that would normally set the rumor mill ablaze was the fact that the eyes were still functional. The only other oddity, which was significantly more mundane, was that the skin was rubbed with charcoal, making it completely black. One of the attending policemen was a mortician who paled at the sight, because he didn't see the corpse as human, but as a black Xeno. He offered to escort the corpse to the morgue. But fortunately, the mortician on duty was also one of the morticians as well. They realized the problem, and they needed to do something obscene to divert any mounting public perception of the events. They knew if a killer was putting eyes onto one corpse was unlikely to stop at one, but they couldn't allow this to continue. So the mortician who found the corpse elected to do a twofold operation. Search for the killer, they thought, was the obvious one, but they had to divert attention away from this as well. Many are familiar with Jack the Ripper case. Some of you reading this may also be Ripperologists. So, instead of rehashing the case, I will point out that the actual murderer was a mortician who used his police officer skills to create the sensational kills and to get any information about the killer he truly sought. 3 weeks, that is how long it took to find the killer that the mortician sought. Did it never strike you as strange as to why the murder of prostitutes made the headlines in Victorian London? However, the killer himself was unusual. His skin was artificially black like his victims, but he lacked the extraneous eyes his victims had. He had the right holes for the extras, but they were empty. And he turned to the mortician, and he froze. They conversed for a few hours, and it turns out that the Black Xenos would take a human test subject and try to figure out how to get past the death problem. The Xenos would inflict countless experiments on the subject and record everything to do with the many limits of the human body. But this man was another experiment. He was given a serum that modified his body chemistry to a point that the modern term for it is zombie. His brain function is severely limited, but judging by the bruising still evident on his skin, he has been struck by lightning, and it seems to have awakened the higher functions that had been deactivated. The zombie remembered every hellish experiment he was subjected to, and after they neutered most of the higher functionality, he was sent back to Earth. It was hypothesized the lightning strike triggered a chemical reaction that allowed the brain to recover memories of the experiments that the zombie went through. 5 people were killed by this zombie, 5 bodies with eyes that were not connected to any ocular nerves, but still able to move. The zombie explained how he suffered repeated traumas to allow the Black Regalians to understand the limits of human physiology. He was then healed afterwards, and his memories were wiped. Then the process would repeat, After the lightning strike, he would have flashes of memory involving tall black humanoids with large eyes watching him, as he would suffer significant biological trauma. This caused him to freak out and start finding his tormentors, and in the zombie's words, make them see. After reading the case file, I looked over at the mortician. "So, you know where the mush corpses come from then?" I asked as I walked over to her. She shot me a questioning look. "Repeated significant biological trauma, like enduring someone over and over again, or killing them over and over again." I glare at her before I continue. "Did you ever wonder what their true intentions were? Just because they say one thing doesn't mean they don't mean something else. For all we know, they treat their guinea pigs, as science shows, like they did when they performed surgeries for the rich and elite. Or they use them as props in a science fair. Or they are trying to figure out the most effective ways to kill us, when there are plenty of things that can easily kill us on this planet already, before we even venture into cryptid territory." I ended with a snarl. "Or they actually are trying to remove death from us. Slaves that are weak as humans are would be a huge waste of time, unless they couldn't stay dead. Maybe their intentions are honest. If so, why the mush corpses? Someone is trying to send us a message, and if people are too thick to even notice that that is what is going on, it could be a test." I have noticed movement outside of my domicile lately. Normally, I would have explained it as kids trying to mess with me, or gang members trying to prove how tough they are. But given the revelations that I have experienced recently, my opinion is slightly more extraterrestrial. Given the apparent lack of information that I was given, I spoke with a mortician who worked the more recent alien event. I asked where this organization came from. She looked at me and explained that the organization has been around for centuries, but the more formal aspects of working together across the globe came from what is referred to as the event. And as soon as she spoke, she froze like a statue. I looked around, thinking that the alien had infiltrated this place, but I saw nothing. Turning back, she mumbled that she could not discuss this matter further, and then left abruptly. I stayed at the meeting point for a while, rereading the original study of the Dogman experiments. This will be a separate case file upload. I would have done it sooner, but I found about the event. Eventually, I left the meeting point, and as I drove towards my home, my mind wandered. If the interloper was not a black alien, I tried to deduce what it could be. A skinwalker was not likely. The vocal mimicry they possess would have been audibly evident by now. A Wendigo doesn't seem like to me. The Jersey Devil, I hope not, but the size sounds to be bigger and slower. Dogman was a possibility, but seems unlikely. Normal dogs raise their hackles at me, so a dogman would likely attack. The rake hasn't crossed the threshold, so its modus operandi doesn't match. A friend of the Red Room admin that I spoke with. That was a slight possibility. He was vocal that I wouldn't get away with this. And so far, he has been proven wrong. No investigation, no police. So far, anyway. People don't scare me, especially after my personal encounters with cryptids. My phone rang, jolting me out of my meditative contemplation. It was the ex-mortician. He sounded worried. He gave me a rendezvous point and a deadline. and I pulled away. And as I left, I saw a crawler emerge from thigh-high grass right next to my vehicle. 2 hours later, I was at one of the many roadside diners in the continental United States. Weapon and permit were double-checked before I entered, and he sat at a booth, his eyes gazing out into a point in the middle distance. He shook his head to bring himself back as I slid in. "You wish to know more about us?" he asked. "I have been working with you for a while now, and it seems there have been some important details that you've missed out. I think it's time I find out the truth about your organization. Would you care to elaborate?" The diner hostess approached and poured a coffee for us. We nodded in gratitude, and when I met her eyes, I saw that haunted look. "Skinwalker. I used to fish for customers every few months. After the 8th victim, we got a hunting party together. They got the cryptid," the former mortician explained plainly. "Answers that question, but then, what is the event?" The flinch was worrying, but I held my ground. Having traveled with this man and the cryptids we have seen, him reacting to anything other than the memory of his last autopsy. For such a pronounced reaction, it was concerning. "You know those creepypastas about Disneyland and missing kids?" he said with a world-weary sigh. 3 centuries before Disneyland, we found items that could not be easily identified. There were no corpses, no signs of foul play, but the objects were strange. It wasn't until recently that we realized what the items were," he said, more to the table than myself. "Lanyards with the names, ages, and addresses of children, as well as a date, but the dates were all after 1958. They are the children that have been or will go missing from any Disney World or Disneyland amusement park. Every child." He looks at me, with a tear running down his face. "The date when they go missing?" "The date what's left of them are found. Once we saw the logo for the Walt Disney Company, we knew something was going to happen. Some of our number got hired by the company. They were tireless in their investigation, but it wasn't until 3 years after the first was built that the first body was found, or what was left of her. Bite marks going through her body, but upon closer inspection, there were no splintering or damage to the bones that were chomped through. The cast made of the bite was impossible. Fangs and human teeth all intermingled in the bite. It is also unfathomably large from what we can calculate. Apart from the fact that large pieces of her are missing, there is no evidence of a bite other than the imprint. The ribs we could get were pristine, other than the fact that the rib cage and most of her spine is missing. No splintering or damage, no evidence of surgery. It is impossible, and you know what we have seen in our jobs. Naturally, the company were able to keep the families of those missing quiet. The methods of the morticians are forbidden from discussing. We get the right to examine the remains, but all results have been identical. No extraneous damage, no post-mortem bruising, just dead children, and too many questions. Though we do have a hypothesis, or rather, it is more of a philosophical musing. Ever notice how comedians seem to suffer from depression? It is likely they carry such a darkness within themselves that they try to bring joy and laughter to others. If this truly is the case, what darkness lurks within the amusement parks run by Walt Disney. We sip our coffees as we ponder a question that seems too impossible to be real. I would love to immediately refute these claims, but with the cryptids that I have personally encountered and the cases that I have read, I honestly cannot. "Want a party, handsome?" A voice lures out the front of the diner. I sit up and look around. There are 4 people that should be here. Myself, the former mortician, the hostess, and the cook. No extra vehicles were here on arrival, and no other patrons were here. So, who the hell is trying to proposition us? "Want a party, handsome?" The voice repeats, precisely. A shriek forces me into action. The hostess drops the glass pot of coffee and shrieks again. And as I stand up, I looked outside to see a rotting animal standing up on its hind legs, looking at least 12 feet tall. A skinwalker. "Get them out of here!" I roar. Its gaze shifts between me and the mortician, who is pushing the hostess towards the back. Another voice can barely be heard. I'm not sure, but it sounds like a reply to the skinwalker's hook. "Let's party." And here are the top comments from my last video. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.